Before we begin the event, I'd like to start by reading the Land Acknowledgement Statement. We would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. So for today's very special event, let's welcome Dr. Rana L Caliyubi, who is CEO of the company Affectiva, author of the very highly rated book, Girl Decoded, a Muslim from Egypt, a mother, and our very special guest here today. So the format of this conversation today is going to be quite informal. We'll be having a fireside chat. So anyone in the audience, if you have questions or comments for our speaker, please put them in the chat and I will read them out loud. Or if you're comfortable, you can even just unmute your microphone and ask aloud. But to get us started, Rana, for those in the audience who haven't yet read your book, could you maybe just tell us a bit about your background and your story?
Of course, yeah. Thanks, Kalina. And hi, everybody. Thank you for having me and thank you for joining us. We are a pretty small group. So one of the things I found with these conversations is I get to make many new friends. So if you are comfortable and want to engage, please share who you are and what you do. And yeah, please, let's keep this as interactive as possible. So a little bit about myself. I grew up in the Middle East. I was born in Egypt. We're originally from Egypt, from Cairo. And my parents moved to the Middle East. So both my parents are in technology. They actually met at a programming class. My dad taught COBOL, which is an obsolete programming language at this point. He taught it in the 70s. And my mom must have been one of the very first women to pursue a career in technology in the Middle East. And, at the time, this was early 70s. And so they met, got married, moved to Kuwait. They both had careers in technology. So I grew up around, in a household that was very much surrounded by the latest and greatest devices and technologies. And it always struck me how technology brought our family together in very interesting ways. So for example, we used to have a gaming console, an Atari gaming console, and now I'm dating myself. And I have two younger sisters, and we used to play Space Invaders, and it just struck me how it brought us all together, and we had a lot of fun. It wasn't about the game; it was more about like how we engaged around this tech. And so, I studied computer science as an undergraduate at the American University in Cairo. And then decided to pursue my PhD, essentially at this kind of exploring this human-machine interface. So I became very interested in emotional intelligence and how can we build that into our machines. And so I spent the last 20 plus years exploring what does artificial emotional intelligence look like, what sort of applications of this technology can we create and explore, but also obviously some of the ethical and moral implications of this technology. And so I've been really at the forefront of this. After Cambridge, so I went to Cambridge for my PhD. And then after Cambridge, came to MIT as a postdoc and very quickly started a company, basically spun out of MIT. And just last week, we announced that Affectiva, my company, is getting acquired. So it's hot off the press and very exciting. And I'm happy. It's not in the book. But I'm happy to talk about that as well.
Congratulations. And yeah, certainly. there's so much to talk about. There's kind of your amazing personal life and entire background story, and then like your technical work that you're doing, which is also mind-blowing. But maybe let's start kind of talking about a little bit more about your background and then working our way toward present day. So What was it like growing up as a woman interested in technology in the Middle East?
It's kind of interesting. I was completely oblivious to the fact that there were very few women in tech, right? I saw my mom. She had a career in technology. She was a systems analyst at the super, like one of the top banks in Kuwait. And then she switched careers and became a computer science teacher in high school um, for high school kids. So I just was not aware of this whole gender issue in tech. I first became aware of it when I went to Cambridge as a PhD student. And there were about 130 or so PhD students, only 5 were women. And that was when I looked around and I was like, wow, I'm a minority here. And so the 5 of us got together and we created the Women at the Computer Lab group, and it's still going strong, 20 plus years on. But that was my first realization that tech has a gender problem. And then of course I got to MIT, and once again I realized there were very few, maybe the number of PhD students and postdocs was kind of balanced, but at the faculty level and the leadership level there were very few women. So and it's the same in the startup industry, and we can talk a lot about that. I've raised over $50 million of funding from the venture community, and especially in the early days in 2009 when we spun out, we pitched to maybe 30 or so investors. 0 were women, like 0, not even like it was just. So I've become very passionate about advocating for diversity in tech, not just gender diversity, but all sorts of diversity. And we need that from we need more founders, but we also need more funders. We need more female funders to invest in different ideas, because people, as an investor, you invest in what you're comfortable with, and it's really hard, especially my co-founder is an MIT professor, Rosalind Picard, and she and I, when we were initially pitching for the company, like 2 women scientists coming out of academia, pitching an emotion company to primarily a male, white male audience. So we were definitely different than what they were used to seeing. And it made it a lot harder.
Definitely. And emotional AI isn't really something that a lot of people know about either. So could you tell us a bit about, how that's different from just artificial intelligence?
Yeah, the hypothesis or the thesis, I guess, is very simple. When you look at human intelligence, your cognitive intelligence or your IQ is important, of course, but your EQ, your emotional intelligence, your ability to tap into other people's emotions and states of mind and really kind of empathize with others, that's what really makes people successful. So people who have higher EQs tend to be more persuasive, they're more likable, they're able to motivate people to change behaviors, they're just more successful people. So I believe that that's true for technology, especially tech that interacts with us so closely on a day-to-day basis. I mean, like if you look at all these devices that's so deeply ingrained in our lives, usually the emphasis on designing these technologies are about the IQ of these things, but nobody really thinks about the EQ and nobody really takes a very human-centric approach to developing these technologies. So, and that applies to your phone or your car or, the Amazon Alexas of the world. I'm pointing in this direction. Sometimes she hears me mention her name and she'll wake up in the middle of a talk. But she so yeah, so it can take many factors, but all of these devices need to have emotional intelligence and empathy.
So how do you teach a device or computer to be empathetic?
So again, like we draw inspiration from how humans do it, right? And if you look at how humans communicate, only 10% or less of how we communicate is in the actual choice of words we use. 90% is nonverbal, and it's split equally between your facial expressions, your hand gestures and body posture, and your vocal intonations, like how much energy is in your voice, your prosodic features. So these nonverbal signals are the majority of how we communicate. But when you look at how we often communicate digitally, a lot of that I call it disappears into cyberspace, because we're often texting, or at best we're sending emojis. Sometimes we're in a Zoom call like this one, but if we were all together in the same room, I would see, people's responses, and I would be able to riff off of that energy of the audience and build on it and adapt. I can't do that right now because, Kalina, I can only see you and everybody else, right? So it becomes really hard to build this feedback loop and emotional connection. And that's, thank you, Stuart. Hi. So it just becomes really, and that's what this technology is designed to build. Essentially, we use computer vision and machine learning to train algorithms to detect all of these nuanced, complex states, like, did I raise my eyebrows? Did I nod my head? Did I, am I falling asleep? Hopefully nobody's falling asleep right now, but we do that a lot for cars. There's a lot of applications, basically.
How do you feel about Zoom and everyone being on that these days? Do you think it's more effective than texting with emojis, or is it still not quite up to par?
I first of all, I think the last year has accelerated our adoption of technology, and also our realization that, wow, like we rely on technology for connection and communication a ton, right? So on the one hand, I'm very grateful that we have tools like Zoom, because it has allowed us to connect over the last year. But I also recognize that this is like V1.0 of all of this. And the last year has accelerated interest in technology like emotion AI, because imagine if we were able to incorporate that into Zoom. And even without me seeing everybody's videos, I could just see like a real-time curve. All of us could see a real-time graph of the level of engagement. Imagine if a teacher could have that kind of view. Or imagine if, as you as a presenter or a lecturer, when you have hundreds of people joining and you have no idea, who's paying attention, who's confused, who's engaged. So I think we're just seeing the beginning of these kinds of platforms, and we're going to see a lot more like innovation built on top of it. So I'm excited about that part of it.
It is certainly an exciting future. You mentioned, there's so many applications of this. The one you just called out was detecting people getting sleepy behind the wheel. Mm-hmm. And obviously there's a lot of positive things, but there's also some potential negative downsides, like, maybe a customer service representative being penalized for not smiling enough at customers, or I don't know. What are your thoughts on kind of both the positives and the negatives and the pros and cons of this?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because I fundamentally believe there's a ton of positive that can come out of this technology, but I don't want to be naive. And so I also acknowledge that there are many ways this can be used to harm people. So I'll start with the positive, and then I'll tackle kind of some examples of how it could be abused. So on the positive side, the very first application we explored was in autism. When I was at MIT, it was the project that brought me over actually to MIT. We partnered with the School for Autistic Kids, and we built like a Google Glass device, and the device in real time had a little camera, and in real time gave the child, we focus on kind of an adolescent population, it gave them real time feedback on the emotions or the expressions of the people they're interacting with. And we found that because a lot of kids on the spectrum avoid face and eye contact altogether, so they just miss on all of these signals. And with this device, we noticed that the kids were actually doing a lot more face contact, and they were getting real-time kind of feedback and positive reinforcement, which changed their behavior over time. So it was really successful. And we're now partnered with a company called Brain Power, and they deploy this tech. They're actually focused on they use Google Glass and our technology, and they've piloted this in like 400 homes around the US, and the results look very promising. So that's like one bucket where I think it can be really helpful. The other is around mental health. You can, given the amount of time we spend in front of our devices, we know that there are facial and vocal biomarkers for depression and anxiety and stress and even suicide intent. So you could, you could imagine how this technology can flag this to a loved one or a doctor, or, it's like, psychologist or psychiatrist, and get you the help you need. So that's another area that is really transformative. And then automotive, right? Like I forget the statistics, but thousands of people die every year because of human error when driving, and a lot of it is due to distracted or drowsy driving. So now imagine if the car can detect that and intervene to save, to keep our roads safer. So that's another one. So these are all like I think, positive examples. On the how can this be used to harm people, it can be used in surveillance. It could be used to spy on people. It could be used to detect, for lie detection. And in the wrong hands, it could be used to manipulate people's decision making, because our emotions are very personal, and it's how we make decisions. So as a company, we've basically, what's the word? Like, we have very strong core values around making sure that this technology has to be used with people's consent. We also steer away of industries like surveillance and security, and we've basically turned down, over $40 million of funding from the venture arm of an intelligence agency, because they wanted to pivot the company to security applications. And I feel like the technology is not there. We don't have regulation in place to regulate how it's being used. The consumers have no idea. And so I just don't think it's the right time or place to use this technology. Yeah. And even with our acquisition last week, our buyer is a company that does eye tracking. And we've had several conversations with them around, where do we draw the line? What are the ethical uses of our combined technologies, and where do we feel like we should take a stance and say no?
Yeah, those are really important conversations to have, especially in an unregulated, new area like this. Yeah. A lot of what you're doing sounds so futuristic. It's kind of hard to believe that this is already here. So I'm curious what you think the future of this field is going to be like in 10 years and 100 years.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that our technology is in use every day. Like, one of the use cases of the technology is to understand how people respond to content. So imagine if you're watching, a video ad or like a Netflix TV show, and the content creator wants to know, this was supposed to be tear-jerking. Did you actually cry, or were you rolling your eyes, right? Or if this particular piece of content was offensive to a certain group of people. And this doesn't come out in surveys, right? But with our technology, you can see the moment by moment response. So that product has been in market since 2011. It's deployed in 90 countries around the world. So this technology is here already. I think where this is headed in the future, what I'm most excited about is once you start integrating this into our everyday devices, like our cars or our phones, or again, social robots, right? Like robot helpers at home can start to know if you're having a bad day, and it can make suggestions. Or if you wake up and you look really tired, or can say, oh, Rana, you look tired today. Like, how about we cancel this meeting you have at noon and go out for a walk, right? Like it can nudge you towards positive, or okay, my favorite example, I really need that, especially with the pandemic. Like, imagine if your fridge had an emotion chip, and it recognizes that you're stress eating, and then it says, Kalina, you've had 5 tubs of Ben and Jerry's already. I'm locking, no more, done. You don't look like you binge eat ice cream. I do. So
I won't admit to it, but I might. Yeah.
So there's a lot of, basically, I think at some point in the future, this is just going to be the de facto human machine interface. We're not going to be interacting with our devices using, it used to be, way back when, it used to be punch cards, and then we evolved into keyboards and a mouse, and then touch, and then voice. And I think eventually it's just going to be perceptual, right? And it'll mirror human to human communication, will look very much like human to machine interactions. It's going to be the same through perception, conversation, empathy. And I actually think that's a good thing, because if you don't use a muscle, it atrophies. And I have a 12-year-old son, and he spends a lot of time in front of various devices. And I worry that he's not practicing his EQ skills, right? Because the computer has no idea. It's oblivious to all of that. But if it demanded, right? Like if he had to be polite, if he had to be empathetic, and if the machine, recognized his emotional state and responded differently, then I think he would be more motivated to apply these skills.
That's a really interesting point. And I wonder how he feels about that. Like, does he see a need to be polite, or does technology make it so that you don't really need that anymore? Like, does the future, I don't know, the future might be different because of all of this technology not really requiring us to interact with each other in the same way. I don't know, curious what you think about that.
I think the thing that struck me the most is one of the main applications of the technology is in social robots, right? So we power a number of the emotion brains of a number of social robots out there. One was called Jibo. It spun out of MIT, and the company doesn't exist now, but the robot still exists at MIT. And then SoftBank have a robot called Pepper. It's like a, this size humanoid robot. And we're the emotion brain of that robot too. What struck me in kind of observing how people interact with these robots, adults are usually like skeptical, and they don't really know what to do and how to approach it. I took some of these robots to my son's class when he was like 7 or 8 years old, and the kid loved it. Like everybody wanted the robot at home. And I was like, what would you do with it? And one kid wanted the robot to help with math homework, and one kid wanted to bring the robot to school as a friend. So I think kind of the younger generation, they're very comfortable with these types of devices. And in fact, my son will call Alexa, he calls her an assistant, right? Alexa's an assistant, but Jibo is a friend. So wow. He already realizes that they have very different personalities and different use cases. And I just find that super fascinating.
It really is. Yeah. So the kids are welcoming our robot overlords.
Right.
Right. So how did you get into this field?
I think I was always like super interested in this like touch point between humans and machines. I found it really fascinating. And I projected that in the future, machines are just going to be so much more deeply ingrained in our lives. But I think the aha moment was when I first got to Cambridge University. It was my first experience being away from home and away from my family. And I was also like a young bride at the time. And I think I was only 19 and had just gotten married. And it was my first experience away from my husband at the time. And I got to Cambridge and I realized, wow, I'm spending so much time in front of this computer, but it's oblivious to how I'm feeling. And even worse, it was like the main mode of communication I had with my family back home, pretty much like the last year with the pandemic, right? Like I relied on technology exclusively to connect with my family. And I just realized that it created an illusion of a connection, but it was not a real connection. And that got me thinking, what if our machines could understand human emotions just like we could? And what if my computer could tell the difference between literally like a smile and a smirk, which, they both involve the same region of the face, but they have very different meanings. And so that was the impetus. That was the starting point 21 years ago.
And did you always have grand aspirations to be CEO, entrepreneur, or how did you get into that role?
Oh, no. I was actually really fixated on becoming faculty, which is why I traveled abroad to do my PhD. So the plan was super well laid out. Graduated top of my class, got the scholarship to go do my PhD. I wanted to come back and teach at the American University in Cairo. And I think what happened is when I first got to Cambridge, my eyes were just open to this new universe of research. And then once again, when I got to MIT, at MIT, it was interesting because I was very focused on the autism use case. But because we were at the Media Lab, twice a year, we would host all of these industry sponsors, like Fortune 500 companies. And twice a year we would do that. And it was like show and tell. You had to show a demo. In fact, we called it demo or die. You had to show a demo of your technology. And all these top executives would say, oh, we want to buy, Pepsi wanted to buy it to like understand how people reacted to new products. And Bank of America wanted to, measure customer experience. And so the list kept going on, and Toyota wanted to measure drowsiness, like even back then. So I kept a log in my notebook. I just kept a log of all these different use cases. And when we got to about 20, I thought we needed to hire more PhD students in the lab. And the lab director at the time, Frank Moss, he said, no, this is not research anymore. This is a commercialization opportunity. And you guys ought to spin out. And that was the impetus for starting the company. So I really did not, I never thought of myself as a entrepreneur or, as a startup founder, but I love it. It's an emotional roller coaster, but it's exciting.
You mentioned starting out in academia and wanting to do research, and the group you're talking to, we're in academia doing research and applied science. I'm wondering if you have any advice for the women and men here who might, have grand ideas, or I don't know, be struggling with being a minority, or I don't know, what kind of advice do you have for people like us, women in research in academia that are in technology and are, in the minority, and it doesn't always work out for the best.
Yeah, I think one of my and I talk a lot about that very openly in the book. And maybe I'll share the example and then back into like the key learnings. So when we started Affectiva, I was the chief technology officer, and Roz, who's my co-founder, she stayed at MIT. So we hired a business executive to be the CEO. And he was the CEO between 2009 and 2013. And in 2013, he decided to move on. So the question became, who should be the next CEO? And a few people on our board / investors said, well, Rana should be, it's her baby, it's her technology. And so they asked me, do you want to be the CEO? And I went back home and I thought about it. And I was like, I've never been CEO before. Like, I don't want to fail. And I went back the next day and I said, I can't take the job. Now, at the same time, our head of sales, who had also never been CEO before, and he was only at the company for a year, he said, I'll take the job. And so he took the job. He became the CEO, right? And 2 years later, I was flying back from my TED Talk and just kind of reflecting. And I was like, I wonder, what are the actual, like, what's the actual job description of a CEO? And I Googled and I started this like bulleted list. And as I was typing it, I was like, wow, I'm doing the job. Like, I had raised capital for the company. I was the face of the technology category. I was very deeply involved in product development and R&D. And I was like, I'm kind of doing the job. And I had to, like, I switched my mindset on whether I was ready or not. And when I made that jump and believed in myself, it was so, I went to him, we had a chat, obviously iterated on it, took it to the board. They unanimously voted for me to step into the CEO role. And that was like 5 years ago. And so my biggest takeaway is, don't let that voice of inner doubt, I call it the Debbie Downer voice in your head. Don't let that stand, be an obstacle. Don't be your biggest obstacle. There are so many obstacles in life. Don't be one of them, right? Like, don't stand in your own way. So I think that's often when you're a minority, you second guess yourself and you have this narrative in your brain that's like, oh, you can't do that. You'll never be successful. Nobody will accept it. I use journaling as a way to have a conversation with myself. I will literally have a rebuttal with myself. You can't do this. Well, wait a second. Maybe I can, because, the following 3 reasons, and I'm a domain expert and I have credibility and I really want to do it. So I'll have this conversation with myself in my journal. It's very funny.
It reminds me in a different context, but one of the things that I've always heard is that men in general tend to apply for positions if they meet like 50% of the requirements, but women have to meet like 90 or something before they're comfortable going for that. So
Exactly.
don't-
Yeah, and now at Affectiva, I try to have like my antennas up for this kind of, some women on our team will not take the risk, right? And I'll say, hey, Ashley, I think you're actually ready for this. Like, why don't you like take it on? You'll be successful, right? And I try to nudge, the women on our group to raise their hands, even though they don't check 100% of the requirements.
That's important. Would you say that being a woman has affected your path? Like, do you think you'd still be doing what you were if you were born a man?
Never been asked that. I don't know. I will say though, I don't want to generalize, because some of my favorite like friends and mentors are hugely empathetic men. So I do feel like I score high on the empathy scale, and I've been able to use that in how I connect both as a parent and as a leader at the company. Like empathetic leadership, I think, is really key. And again, the last year has really, I think, shown us that, yeah, when you lead with empathy, you can build a lot of trust and loyalty and camaraderie and motivate people. So I've always been an empathetic leader, but I can't, now I talk a lot more openly about it. I think it does make us special, even in the way we partner with other companies, right? Like in this whole acquisition process, I approached it with a lot of empathy. And when in my conversations with the CEO, Martin, who bought our company, I would say things like, this is like my baby. Your company's like your baby. How does it feel? And this like big, he's Swedish, right? So this like big Swedish guy would talk about his emotions. It was really funny. But I think this is how you build trust. So I guess I've turned it into a superpower.
You do sure sound like a superwoman. So we have about 10 minutes left in this event, and I want to open it up to audience questions. Nobody has been posting in the chat, but maybe people are shy. So I want to just make some space for people to ask their questions now. Feel free to unmute if anyone has any comments or thoughts.
Hi, Rana. My name is Xiaoxia Liao. I don't know if you recognize the photo in my background.
Do I? Is this Cambridge? Like, where is this?
Yes.
It is, right.
It's a Boston Common.
Oh,
it's that street side of it. So I went to a conference in Boston in 2019 November, and I said in a talk that at that time you were able to give it in person. So
yeah, that was I guess that was right before the pandemic, huh? And
lots of things that you just hi. So you just talked. I heard it before. So I'm so happy that NCSA invited you to our Zoom meeting, and I thank Kalina a lot, and thank you for joining us. I have one question for you. I know that your company is now acquired by Smart Eye. So what is your plan for your future? What do you see in 3 or 5 years? What will you be doing?
Do you mean me personally or the company, the combined company, or both?
Both.
Okay.
So how about would you please describe both? I know you will be acting as deputy CEO for a couple of years, and so what do you see your role in this different CEO? Yeah. And what do you see your company, the acquired company in 3-5 years? What do you see your personal or professional in 3 or 5 years?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the good news is with this it's almost like a merger of equals. So all of our teams are combining, which is nice. The main focus for the next couple of years is to get our technology in the cars and save lives. Like that's like the main focus. Beyond that, I hope we get to explore other applications like social robots, or mental health is another big one. And I know Martin, the CEO of Smart Eye, he's very interested in exploring other industries as well. My role as deputy CEO is essentially to tag team with Martin and figure out how to integrate our teams effectively. I'll tell you, the very first question we're all debating is whether they use Microsoft Teams and we use Zoom. And you have no idea. It's like turning into this like big political thing. So first order of business is to figure out if we're going to use Teams or Zoom, and then we'll figure out how to integrate the rest of the companies. But basically, I want to make sure that we stay at the forefront of building kind of state-of-the-art machine learning and AI and applying it in the right way. Honestly, I have also so many ideas that I want to explore. Like with the book, I feel like there's a lot of potential to support, to be a voice for women in AI in particular. I want to maybe explore being an investor. I don't know, question mark. So I'm just open to a lot of things, and we'll see. You'll have to bring me back in a couple of years and I'll share. But
maybe you'll write another book or inspire more women along the way by giving talks.
I hope so. I think one thing that I definitely want to keep doing is just, support not just women, but support people who are in, earlier in their entrepreneurship journey or academic journey. And if I can be helpful, I want to inspire more people. So we'll see. Or maybe I will just like move to an island somewhere and just, like sit down. So.
That's a great idea.
It sounds nice. Yeah, but I don't know if I'll do that.
Do it if you can. Does anyone else have Does anyone else have other questions or comments?
Yeah, I was just curious. You do so much with technology and obviously with AI and all of that, and you have this high emotional intelligence. How do you find space to keep and maintain that in what I can only imagine is an unbelievable day every day? How do you manage that without, frankly, running out of gas?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I especially earlier on in Affectiva's journey, I was really bad at keeping any sort of balance in my life. And again, I talk about that in the book because I do think it cost my marriage. I was so focused on the company. I was so focused on the kids, and there was no time for anything else. And so I've become really cognizant and aware of that. And I love doing Zumba. Zoom, it's like a dance exercise, and I put it on my calendar. It's there for everybody in the company to see. It's on Wednesdays from 11 to 12 and Fridays from 5 to 6. Everybody can, people know they cannot schedule meetings on top of it. And I think it's good for two reasons. First, it shows that I believe in mental and physical health, and I for me, but also for my team. So it gives people permission to also, take time out for self-care. And I hope it's also sets a good example for my kids as well. So they see me work hard, but they also know that mom, stays mentally and physically fit. So it's a journey though. Yeah.
That sounds like great leadership, kind of just showing, that you're a person and you have needs and you recognize that others do as well.
And I think also, again, over the last year in particular, because we all show up, on a Zoom call and you can see my background, but you don't know what kind of chaos is happening outside of the camera's field of view, right? So very early on in the pandemic, we gave people permission. We said, you know what, we are like working longer days and it's back to back to back to back. Feel free to carve out time on your calendar, you know, do laundry or make lunch for your young kids or check in on your older parents or go for a walk. And we just built that flexibility into people's schedules. And I think it helped a lot earlier on as we navigated, you know, what was really like stressful, even if people didn't realize it, it was really stressful.
Yeah, of course. I think we have time for one more question.
Well, let's see. If I pick one, how about this one? So there's always a struggle. I don't know. Maybe as a superwoman, we didn't quite feel this way, but it seems like there's always a struggle between doing management and developing technology. And I wonder if, you know, if leading the company, you feel like, oh, but I really want to go over and do more research. I don't know. How do you, but you've been doing this now. How do you feel about that balance now?
Yeah, I love this question because especially when I first stepped into the CEO role, I felt like I was essentially useless, right? Because I had stopped coding and I was like, what's the value? What value am I adding? And I started this series of like every other week I'd send an email to the whole team. And the title was, what does a CEO do anyways? And it was almost as a way of me explaining to myself first, like how am I spending the time? How am I adding value? I still miss coding, but the way I compensate for that, I guess, I still sit in some of the code review meetings with the team, not code review, but when we're reviewing like the accuracy of the classifiers or looking at mitigating data bias or algorithmic bias, I will literally like spend hours with the team and geek out on all of that. And I love it. So even though I don't code anymore, I still try to stay close to the science. Yeah.
Thank you. So that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today, sharing your stories with us. As a reminder to everyone in the audience, we are having a book raffle, so please register if you haven't already. I just shared the link in the chat. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Rana, for joining us.
Thank you, Kalina, and thanks everybody for joining. If you read the book, please share what resonated with you, and I'm also very easy to find online, so please stay in touch.